Have you ever wondered why the modern world works this way? Why do some nations have incredible power, while others have always remained in the shadows? What if I told you that the keys to understanding these global imbalances lie not in the economic realities or political intrigues of recent centuries, but deep in the past, in an era that many consider barbaric and primitive? What if the most devastating conflicts in human history, the medieval English wars, were actually the catalyst for unprecedented changes that literally redrawn the map of the world and forever changed the course of civilization? Prepare for a journey through time, where each battle was not just a clash of armies, but also a deadly battle of ideas, technologies, and ambitions that still shape our present. These wars were a real melting pot in which the national identity of England was forged, where the longbow broke the power of feudal lords and taxes turned peasants into the mainstay of royal power. We will see how the monarch's fist crushed feudal freedom, how the necessities of war gave birth to parliament, and how firearms changed the rules of the game. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn not just dry facts from a history textbook, but shocking, bone-chilling details about how the English wars of the Middle Ages, seemingly closed in their temporal and geographical context, became the very push that brought down the old order and laid the foundation for a completely new world. For decades after the Norman conquest of 1066, England remained a country divided not only by language, but also by culture. The ruling elite spoke French, laws were written in French, and most kings saw England as only one more domain in their vast French empire. The local population, descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, were only second-class subjects. This duality was a constant source of internal tension and external weakness. However, a succession of wars, especially the Table War, 1337-1453, became the brutal but necessary melting furnace that forged the modern English nation. As the English kings lost their continental possessions in France, from Normandy to Gascony, their attention became increasingly focused on England itself. The need to mobilize the population for long and costly wars against France forced the kings to appeal not only to the aristocracy, but also to the common people. It was then that a dramatic shift in language and culture took place. English, long considered the language of the lower strata, gradually began to replace French. Kings who needed the support of their subjects began issuing edicts in English, and parliamentary debates were increasingly conducted in their native language. By the end of the Hundred Years' War, English had become the official language, a symbol of a unified identity. The abandonment of French as the language of power was not just a linguistic change, but a powerful statement of the independence and uniqueness of the English nation. This was a decisive step in the formation of a unified national identity, when people began to perceive themselves not as Normans or Anglo-Saxons, but as Englishmen. These changes would not have occurred so quickly and dramatically without the constant external threat that required internal unity. This process of national formation was inextricably linked with the awareness of a common enemy and common goals. The wars against France, despite their severity and sacrifice, paradoxically brought together the disparate elements of English society. Shared victories, such as Crécy and Poitiers, and shared defeats, such as the final loss of continental possessions, created a unified narrative, collective memory, and sense of belonging. Gradually, a new self-determination was formed, which went beyond feudal oaths and local affiliations. The British began to see themselves as a single community, united not only by their geographical location, but also by a common language, history, and, importantly, common enemies. This new national feeling has become a powerful force capable of mobilizing the resources and will of the people to defend their interests. The kings, realizing this potential, began to actively use the rhetoric of national unity, appealing to the patriotic feelings of their subjects. Thus, the Hundred Years' War, which began as a dynastic conflict over the French throne, eventually transformed into a catalyst that allowed England to find its own unique identity, breaking away from its Norman past and becoming a truly English nation. Before the advent of the longbow, European battles were mostly the arena for heavy cavalry, armored knights who were considered invincible. The battle, in fact, was reduced to a series of individual duels. However, the English wars, especially with France, showed that this outdated tactic was doomed. It was then that a simple but deadly weapon came on the scene, which forever changed the face of war and undermined the foundations of feudal society. At the beginning of the 100 Years' War, when the English armies, consisting of a large number of infantry with longbows, first faced the French knights at the battles of Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, something incredible happened. Squads of archers, drawn from ordinary English and Welsh peasants and yeomen, literally rained down a hail of arrows on the enemy, capable of piercing knights' armor at a considerable distance. Up to 12 arrows per minute fired by each archer created a density of fire unimaginable for that time. Thousands of such arrows turned the battlefield into a meat grinder, making heavy cavalry attacks suicidal. This meant that from now on, not only a knight could be an effective warrior, a simple peasant trained in the use of a bow could deliver a fatal blow to the most powerful lord. It was not just a military coup, but also a social one. The role of the infantry increased dramatically, which undermined the centuries-old hierarchy based on noble origin and land ownership. Military power now depended not only on the number of knights, but also on well-trained and disciplined foot soldiers, which gave an impetus to the development of professional armies. The effectiveness of the longbow was not only in its killing power and rate of fire, but also in the possibility of mass use. It took years, considerable funds, and a special social status to train a knight. The longbow, on the other hand, only required a lot of training and physical strength. Royal decrees required all men in certain age groups to practice archery regularly. This created a huge pool of potential soldiers, independent of the feudal system and the personal obligations of the lords. Thus, the longbow became a democratizing weapon, which not only equalized the chances on the battlefield, but also allowed representatives of the lower classes to prove themselves in military affairs, thereby increasing their social significance. The Battle of Agincourt, 1415, where English archers once again demonstrated their superiority over French cavalry, only cemented this change. These victories were a triumph not only of English weapons, but also of a new approach to warfare, where the discipline and tactics of the infantry prevailed over the individual valor of the knights. The consequences were far-reaching. The decline in the importance of chivalry led to the weakening of the feudal system and the strengthening of royal power, which could rely on a wider range of its subjects. So, from the peasant huts came weapons that not only defeated enemies on the battlefields, but also reshaped the social landscape of medieval England. The revolution in military affairs was irreversible, and its echoes are still felt today. Long, costly wars required enormous resources. The feudal system, based on corvée and in-kind taxes, proved unable to finance large-scale military campaigns. The kings needed not just soldiers, but money, a lot of money to hire professional archers, spearmen, and then gunners, as well as to build ships and fortresses. This led to fundamental changes in the economic system of England. To finance their wars, the English kings were forced to dramatically increase their tax burden. New taxes were introduced on land, property, trade, and even on each resident, the poll tax. These taxes were levied with unprecedented regularity and in significantly higher volumes than ever before. The peasants, who were already struggling to make ends meet, were under enormous pressure. However, this tough financial squeeze had unexpected consequences. The crown, in need of money, was forced to establish a more efficient tax collection system, which led to the development of a centralized bureaucracy. In addition, the constant need for money stimulated the development of money circulation and commerce, since taxes were required to be paid not in goods, but in coin. Farmers were forced to sell their surplus produce at the market to get cash to pay taxes, which encouraged the development of domestic trade in cities. Ultimately, this contributed to the weakening of subsistence farming and the strengthening of the monetary economy. However, it is worth noting that excessive taxes, especially the infamous poll tax, were one of the main reasons for the peasant uprising of 1381, which showed that the patience of the people is not unlimited. What do you think was more terrible for the peasant? Death on the battlefield or slow, painful ruin due to excessive taxes? Ultimately, these tax reforms laid the foundation for the future capitalist system. The constant demand for money from the state stimulated the peasants to produce goods for sale, and not just for their own consumption. This led to the growth of commodity money relations, the development of markets, and the emergence of a layer of well-off peasants, yeomen, who could pay taxes and invest in their farms. At the same time, the strengthening of the tax apparatus required an increase in the number of officials who managed the collection of funds, which contributed to the development of state institutions and the centralization of power. The crown became increasingly powerful as it received an independent source of income that did not depend directly on feudal obligations. This shift from a subsistence economy to a monetary economy was a slow but irreversible process that ultimately undermined the foundations of feudalism and paved the way for the emergence of a more complex and integrated economic system. Thus, wars, which initially seemed destructive, paradoxically became a powerful engine of economic and social transformation, forcing the state to look for new ways of financing, which in turn stimulated the development of trade, industry, and monetary relations. This was a painful but necessary step towards the formation of a modern state with centralized power and a developed market economy. Moreover, the constant need for financing has led to the development of more complex financial instruments. The kings began to actively use loans from rich merchants and bankers, which contributed to the development of the credit system. New forms of government bonds and debenture emerged that allowed the crown to raise funds on a longer-term basis. This led to the formation of the national debt, which, although it was a burden, also became a tool for maintaining stability and confidence in the state's financial system. The development of customs duties and excise taxes on goods passing through ports and markets has also become an important source of income. These measures not only replenished the treasury, but also contributed to the development of standardization and regulation of trade, which was necessary for effective tax collection. Gradually, the English economy became more and more monetarized, and the role of money as a medium of exchange and capital accumulation increased significantly. This created favorable conditions for the development of entrepreneurship in capitalist relations, where profit and investment became the key driving forces. Long years of feudal fragmentation led to the fact that powerful barons often challenged the power of the king, waging internecine wars and creating a state within a state. The royal power was weak and fragmented. However, the English wars, especially the 100 Years' War and the subsequent War of the Roses, became a catalyst for the centralization of power and strengthening the authority of the monarch. Long military campaigns required the king to mobilize all the resources of the country and tightly centralize coordination. Kings had to create their own standing armies, instead of relying on feudal militias, develop systems of supply and logistics, and appoint loyal officials to keep posts. Feudal lords, weakened by the constant loss of people and resources, especially during the War of the Roses, when they literally exterminated each other, lost their independence and were forced to submit more and more to the royal authority. By the end of the 15th century, the crown, especially under the Tudors, had gained unprecedented power, creating a strong centralized state that could effectively collect taxes, maintain order, and pursue a unified foreign policy. Internecine wars gave way to relatively stable rule, which was impossible without consolidating power in the hands of the monarch. This became the basis for the formation of the future of absolutism and the creation of a powerful national state. In addition to purely military and financial factors, the strengthening of royal power was also due to psychological changes in society. Constant wars and the chaos caused by feudal anarchy led to the fact that the population longed for order and stability. The strong hand of the monarch, capable of ensuring peace and security, became increasingly attractive to the general population. Tired of robbery and civil strife, the kings used this war and anarchy-weary attitude to strengthen their legitimacy and present themselves as the only force capable of ensuring the nation's well-being. They actively formed a cult of royal power, emphasizing its divine origin and exclusivity. This allowed them to demand unconditional loyalty and obedience from their subjects. Thus, wars not only physically weakened the feudal aristocracy, but also created favorable conditions for strengthening the ideological foundations of royal power. The monarch ceased to be only the first among equals of feudal lords and became the symbol of a single nation, the guarantor of order, and the defender of its interests. This was a crucial step towards the formation of a modern, sovereign state, where power was concentrated in the hands of the central government rather than distributed among a multitude of semi-independent lords. It was these wars which seemed so destructive that eventually forged the iron fist of the monarch, which became the foundation for the subsequent greatness of England. At first glance, wars seemed to be a tool for suppressing and strengthening tyranny. However, in England, the constant need of kings to finance wars led to a paradoxical result: the emergence and strengthening of the role of Parliament, which gradually became the voice of the people, at least its wealthy strata, and an instrument for limiting royal power. In order to obtain the necessary funds for waging wars, the kings were forced to regularly convene a parliament, a meeting of representatives of the nobility, clergy, and cities. These representatives not only approved taxes, but also used the opportunity to express their opinions and complaints, demand concessions, and even participate in the adoption of laws. Every time the king needed money for a new military campaign, the parliament gained more influence. This set a precedent. There is no representation without taxes. Gradually, the parliament turned from a mere advisory body into a key institution that could influence public policy, limit the king's arbitrariness, and even remove him, as happened with Edward II and Richard II. Wars forced kings to seek consensus with their subjects, which in the long run led to the development of representative democracy and the concept of citizens' rights. Moreover, it was not only the crown's financial dependence on Parliament that contributed to its strengthening. The wars themselves, especially the 100 Years' War, required the monarch to constantly engage with various sectors of society in order to mobilize resources and gain support. The Parliament has become a convenient platform for such interaction, allowing the king to communicate directly with representatives of counties and cities to find out their needs and problems. This contributed to the development of political consciousness among ordinary people, who, participating in the elections of representatives to Parliament, began to realize their role in the life of the country. Gradually, Parliament became an institution where the interests of various social groups were formed and defended, which led to its division into the House of Lords, representatives of the aristocracy and clergy, and the House of Commons, representatives of knights and citizens. It was the House of Commons, which represented the wider population, that gradually gained more weight and influence. It became a place where not only tax issues were discussed, but also issues of justice, governance, and foreign policy. This process was far from an ideal democracy, as voting rights were limited, but it laid the foundation for the future development of representative government. Thus, military needs unwittingly stimulated the evolution of the English Parliament, turning it from an instrument of fiscal control into a powerful institution capable of protecting the interests of citizens and limiting royal power, which was a unique phenomenon for medieval Europe and the first step towards the creation of modern democratic institutions. Medieval wars, especially their later period, became an arena for the rapid development of military technology. If at the beginning feudal castles were considered impregnable, then by the end of the 15th century, their days were numbered. It was here that a new revolutionary weapon came on the scene, which forever changed the tactics of warfare and forced kings to rethink their military strategies. The emergence of firearms, first primitive cannons, and then handheld firearms, was a real turning point. Although the first cannons were bulky and unreliable, their destructive power gradually grew. For the first time, siege walls that had seemed unshakable for centuries could be destroyed by remote fire. This made feudal castles, symbols of the barons' power, vulnerable. Kings, unlike scattered feudal lords, could afford to produce and maintain artillery, which further strengthened their power and ability to suppress rebellions. The development of gunpowder weapons stimulated metallurgy and new production technologies. With the advent of firearms, tactics also changed. The emphasis shifted to massive infantry fire, which eventually led to the decline of chivalry as the main military force. The Battle of Castillon, 1453, the last major battle of the 100 Years' War, became a symbol of this change of eras. French artillery played a decisive role in defeating the English army. It was the whisper of the future, the harbinger of a whole new era in military affairs. The revolution caused by firearms was not limited to sieges alone. The advent of handheld firearms, such as arquebuses and muskets, gradually changed the tactics of field battles. Although these early samples were slow to cool down and inaccurate, Their psychological effects and ability to pierce armor at close range were enormous. This led to a gradual decline in the role of heavy cavalry and an increase in the importance of disciplined infantry armed with firearms. The creation and maintenance of artillery and musketry regiments required significant investment and centralized management, which was only possible for a strong state. This contributed to the further militarization of society and the development of the military industry. Military engineers began to develop new fortifications that could withstand artillery fire, bastion fortresses, which in turn stimulated the development of fortification art. Thus, firearms have become not just a new type of weapon, but a catalyst for profound structural changes in the military, economy, and politics. It accelerated the decline of feudalism, strengthened centralized royal power, and laid the foundations for the formation of modern professional armies. When asked how these military innovations influenced the future history of England, it is safe to say that they were one of the key factors that determined its path to becoming a great power. In the early Middle Ages, armies were essentially a collection of feudal militias, where each baron brought his own vassals. They were ill-trained, undisciplined forces, loyal primarily to their lord, not to the king. However, long wars required a different approach, a permanent, professional army capable of effectively performing its tasks. The English kings, faced with the need to conduct protracted campaigns abroad, gradually began to abandon the outdated system of feudal militia. Instead, they began hiring professional soldiers, archers, spearmen, and later gunners who served for pay and were loyal only to the crown. This led to the formation of permanent, well-trained, and disciplined armies capable of performing complex tactical maneuvers. Such an army was much more effective than the feudal militia and allowed the king to pursue a single military policy, not depending on the whims of individual barons. The development of such armies also meant the emergence of new logistics systems, supply chains, uniforms, and eventually the formation of military discipline and hierarchy that would form the basis for modern armies. This transition from feudal fragmentation to centralized military power was one of the most important steps towards the formation of modern national states. One of the key factors that stimulated the transition to a professional army was the need for specialized skills that feudal militias could not provide. The longbow, for example, required years of training to achieve the required accuracy and rate of fire. Similarly, handling firearms and artillery required not only physical strength, but also technical knowledge. Such specialists could not simply appear at the request of the feudal levy. They had to be trained and maintained constantly. This led to the emergence of contract armies, where soldiers were hired for a specific period of time or for a specific campaign. The contract system provided the king with greater flexibility and predictability in planning military operations. Instead of the unpredictable number and quality of troops provided by barons, the monarch could rely on a fixed number of trained and equipped warriors. Gradually, these contract armies began to transform into permanent armed forces, which were not disbanded after the end of the war, but remained in the service of the crown. This made it possible to maintain a high level of combat readiness, conduct regular exercises, and constantly improve tactics. The kings invested in the construction of arsenals for the production and storage of weapons, as well as in the creation of barracks to house troops. The emergence of standing armies also necessitated the development of uniform military regulations and rank systems, which ensured uniformity in command and control. Soldiers began to see themselves not as vassals of a particular lord, but as servants of the king and country. This contributed to the strengthening of national unity and patriotism, which will be discussed later. Thus, wars, which require increasingly complex and expensive military vehicles, have become the main engine for the formation of professional armies, which have become the cornerstone of modern nation-states and a tool for maintaining order and protecting national interests. It was a long and bloody journey from scattered feudal detachments to highly organized military formations that would define the face of warfare for centuries to come. Wars are not only open battles, but also covert operations, intrigues, and information gathering. In the Middle Ages, when communications were slow and information was worth its weight in gold, the development of intelligence and espionage systems became vital to success in protracted conflicts. English wars full of dynastic pretensions and political intrigue provided fertile ground for the development of these shadowy aspects of warfare. The English kings and their advisors actively used networks of spies and informers, both inside and outside the country. These agents collected information about the enemy's troop movements, plans, public sentiment, and even the health status of monarchs in other countries. Spy reports, often encrypted, made it possible to make more informed decisions, plan surprise attacks, or, conversely, avoid traps. For example, during the 100 Years' War, British agents might report on the preparation of French reinforcements or on internal disagreements in the French camp. Counterintelligence techniques were developed to detect and neutralize enemy spies. These covert operations, while not as spectacular as jousting, played a huge role in the outcome of wars, giving one side an advantage over the other. It was the forerunner of modern intelligence services, demonstrating that even in the Middle Ages, rulers understood the value of information. In addition to gathering information about the enemy, intelligence also played an important role in maintaining internal stability. Kings used spies to identify potential conspiracies among the nobility, monitor the mood in cities, and prevent uprisings. For example, information about the discontent of peasants or the rebellious mood of barons allowed the crown to take preventive measures, whether it was strengthening garrisons or making changes in tax policy. The development of diplomacy was also closely linked to intelligence. Ambassadors often acted as official spies, gathering information about the political and economic situation in foreign countries, as well as trying to sow discord among the enemy's allies. The use of false documents and disinformation also became part of the arsenal of intelligence activities to mislead the enemy or undermine their morale. The cost of espionage was considerable, but the kings understood that this investment paid off, allowing them to avoid costly mistakes on the battlefield or prevent internal conflicts. At the courts of European monarchs, figures specializing in the Secret Service began to appear more and more often, harbingers of future heads of intelligence agencies. Their work was shrouded in secrecy, and many of their successes, as well as failures, remained unreported in the official chronicles. However, historical data and evidence show that it was during this period that the foundations were laid for the development of sophisticated intelligence networks using various methods, from bribery to the introduction of agents, which will become an integral part of the conduct of wars and international politics in the following centuries. These shadowy plots and devious schemes, invisible to the general public, but crucial to the outcome of conflicts, really taught kings to be more cunning and sophisticated in their struggle for power and influence. Medieval Europe was a predominantly agrarian society, with the majority of the population living in villages. However, wars, although they brought destruction, paradoxically contributed to the growth of cities. Cities became not only centers of craft and trade, but also strategic strongholds that played a key role in military campaigns. During wars, especially long ones, cities became a refuge for people fleeing the devastation of the countryside. Their defensive walls provided relative safety. In addition, cities were centers of production, providing armies with weapons, armor, clothing, and food. The constant need for military supplies stimulated the development of crafts and trade, attracting more and more people to the cities. Kings and barons invested in strengthening the city walls and infrastructure, turning them into strongholds of their possessions. Cities also became centers for collecting taxes and forming troops. The growth of cities led to the emergence of a new social class, the urban burghers, which played an increasingly important role in the economy and politics. These cities, with their workshops, markets, and ships, were hotbeds of innovation and entrepreneurship, harbingers of future industrial centers. What do you think was scarier for a medieval citizen? The risk of a siege or starvation in a ravaged village? In addition to providing shelter and supplying armies, cities played a key role in logistics and communications during wars. They served as transit points for troops, warehouses for supplies, and centers for collecting and distributing information. The development of a road network, although primitive, between cities was driven by military needs, facilitating the movement of armies and trade. For the defense of cities, complex fortifications were built to towers, moats, gates, which stimulated the development of architecture and engineering. City governments, often made up of wealthy merchants and artisans, gained more and more autonomy from feudal lords and kings as their economic power became indispensable for financing wars. They could negotiate privileges with the monarch in exchange for loans or taxes, which contributed to the development of urban self-government and civil liberties. The constant presence of soldiers in cities, their need for goods and services, also stimulated the local economy. Inns, and weapons repair shops all flourished thanks to the war effort. Population migration from rural areas to cities, driven by both the search for security and new economic opportunities, has led to significant demographic growth in urban centers. This created new social structures where merchants and artisans occupied an increasingly prominent position, competing with the traditional aristocracy. As a result, wars, despite their destructive nature, have become a powerful catalyst for urbanization, contributing to the concentration of population, capital, and innovation in cities. This, in turn, laid the foundation for economic growth and the emergence of new social classes that will play a crucial role in shaping modern society. Their growth story is truly astounding, showing how the chaos of war can paradoxically contribute to development and progress. In the early Middle Ages, people felt loyalty mainly to their local lord, village, or region. The concept of nation in the modern sense was practically absent. However, protracted conflicts, especially with an external enemy, have become a powerful catalyst for developing a sense of shared belonging and patriotism. The wars against France, which lasted more than 100 years, forced the British to realize themselves as a single whole, opposing a common enemy. Propaganda, clergymen's sermons, and even folk songs began to celebrate English prowess and denounce French meanness. Victories such as at Crécy and Agincourt became a matter of national pride, and defeats were perceived as a national tragedy. There were common heroes, myths, and symbols that rallied people around the idea of England. Kings and nobles who now speak English have become associated with the national idea. This process was slow and painful, but it was in the crucible of war that a sense of national identity was forged, which later led to the creation of powerful national states and then empires. People began to die not for their lord, but for their country, for England. It was a fundamental shift that changed people's attitudes to the state and to themselves. Cultural aspects also played an important role in shaping national identity. The development of English as the language of the court, administration, and literature has become a powerful unifying factor. The works of authors such as Geoffrey Chaucer, written in English, contributed to the spread of a common literary language and common cultural values. The spread of folk ballads and songs about the heroic battles and exploits of English soldiers strengthened the sense of community and pride in their country. The church also used its sermons to spread the idea of a holy war against the enemies of England, which gave the conflict a moral and religious justification and further rallied the population. Royal propaganda actively used images of patron saints, such as St. George, making them symbols of the national struggle. Along with the development of national identity, the sense of patriotism also grew. People who were previously only bound by feudal allegiance were now beginning to feel an emotional attachment to their country. This patriotism was evident not only on the battlefield, but also in everyday life, in supporting the war effort, in paying taxes, and in participating in victory celebrations. Even defeats, paradoxically, could reinforce this feeling, giving rise to a desire for revenge and increased cohesion. The formation of a common enemy in the face of France during the 100 Years' War, and then internal conflicts such as the Wars of the Roses, which eventually led to the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, reinforced the need for a single, strong government capable of protecting the nation. As a result, by the end of the Middle Ages, the concept of England as a single nation with common interests and destiny became firmly ingrained in the minds of people, laying the foundation for the future greatness of England as a world power. We have come a long way through the centuries, immersing ourselves in the brutal but surprisingly dynamic world of medieval English wars. We have seen how these conflicts, seemingly locked in their own time, have become a powerful catalyst for fundamental change. From the birth of a single English nation and language to the revolution in military affairs with the introduction of the longbow and firearms, from the transformation of the feudal economy through taxation to the strengthening of royal power and the paradoxical growth of the influence of Parliament. From the development of espionage to the prosperity of cities and finally to the formation of a deep sense of national identity and patriotism. Every battle, every warrior who died, every tax collected, all this was part of a complex, invisible process that inexorably pushed the world forward. The medieval English wars didn't just change the course of one country's history, they laid the foundations for the formation of modern nation-states, influenced the development of capitalism, helped flourish the parliamentary system, and forever changed the rules of warfare. If you thought the Middle Ages were an era of stagnation and ignorance, then we hope this video changed your mind. After all, it was in these dark ages that the seeds of the changes that defined our modern society were sown. Don't forget about the past. It's not just stored in textbooks, it lives on in every aspect of our lives today. If this video made you think and you learned something new, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new exciting stories about how the past shapes our future.